Hello, and a warm welcome to this virtual session, Professional Ethics in Practice. Whether you're watching this as a live broadcast or on demand, it's great to have you here. So I'm Richard Silver. I'm a Policy Associate at the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and I'm going to be your chair for this session. It's actually the second session of our Compliance Officers virtual conference for 2025 and one of several that we're broadcasting across the week. We are aiming for this session to be as interactive as possible, actually. So we've already had some questions sent in advance. So big thank you to anyone who's taken the time to do that. However, if you're watching live, then you can also submit questions to us by clicking on the link that you should find below the video. If you send us questions, then you're welcome to include your name, but also you can send those to us anonymously. And we'll try and cover as many as possible during the session today. So just to mention that the session is also going to be available to watch again on the SRA's on-demand webpage with slides and links to the relevant resources also available from that same area, the on-demand part of our website. So please do feel free to share any of the compliance officers' virtual conference videos with your colleagues from that area. A quick word about the running order for today's session. So in a moment, we're going to show you the recording of our session, Professional Ethics in Practice, which was chaired by the journalist Daisy McAndrew and which took place during our in-person compliance conference on the 21st of October 2025. So that runs for about 25 minutes and there are plenty of insights and perspectives in there that hopefully you'll find interesting. Then as soon as we've finished watching that recording, we'll go straight into a discussion with our panel. They'll be taking your questions and I'll introduce you to the panelists straight after the video. You can also find their biographies actually in the conference program if you want to take a look at that. So just to briefly set the scene before we get into the recording. So ethical considerations are of course all around us, and it feels like barely a day would go by without seeing ethics in some form or other in the headlines, with questions about honesty and integrity in public life. So thinking about this in the context of legal service professionals, there's a lot of riding on ethical behaviour. Members of the public rely on those professionals in so many ways, including to help navigate major life events, to help uphold their rights, to get their disputes resolved. And the same goes for business owners who depend on their services so that they can hire and invest with confidence and thrive. So when we look at public perceptions of this, 2/3 of the public say that they do have that confidence in legal service providers. Now that's a good position, but one which is really at constant risk of erosion and can't be taken for granted. Concerns can and do play out in the headlines, for example, over the use of strategic lawsuits against public participation, otherwise known as SLAPs, about the misuse of non-disclosure agreements, or about legal sector workplace culture. And the realities of legal practice, of course, mean that solicitors and their colleagues are routinely presented with quite complex ethical challenges. Now, some of you may know that the Legal Services Board ran a consultation in spring 2025 called Upholding Professional Ethical Duties. And that consultation acknowledges that strengthening ethical duties is actually about more than just regulation, and that there's a need for greater focus and stronger support across the sector. But the big question there is, how does the sector get there from where we are currently? So without further ado, it's now time for us to sit back and watch the recording, and I'll see you again afterwards with our panelists.
Let me tell you who I've got alongside me on the stage here. We've got Dan Kay, founder and CEO of O-Shaped, an organisation that makes the legal profession better for those who are in it. I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about it. Lucy Henderson, head of regulatory management at the SRA, and Jonathan White, head of professional ethics at the SRA. I guess going back to basics is a decent place to start and say, what do we actually mean by the term professional ethics? Jonathan, what does ethics mean in this context?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. It's great to be talking about ethics rather than answering questions about accounts rules or Mazur versus Charles Speechley and things like that. So grateful for the opportunity. I mean, I'll give you a personal view, really. So for me, ethics is really about doing the right thing when no one's looking, where there are no rewards. So, you're in the restaurant, or in my case, probably Wetherspoons, and they they missed the last round of drinks off the bill. So I think everyone in this room, the ethical thing would be to come forward and, be clear about that. The same when the supplier miscalculates the invoice and misses £10,000 off it. You're very clear and open about that. So why is it so important? Well, as a profession, as lawyers, we're involved in so many important fundamental issues of people's lives. The amount, the power that we have, and the responsibility that we have with that is just so critical. And as Lord Denning said, lawyers are trusted to the ends of the earth, and this is really why ethical behaviour is so important. There's been quite a few people coming back to the question to try and define what professional ethics is. So the LSB made quite a good job of that in their consultation, and we responded to that. But I think, for me, I think the SRA principles do a really good job of actually setting out what the main issues are here. I think on the issue of ethical principles, I think the one thing that strikes me is that not all principles are equal. So there are 7 of them, and I think what's particularly relevant at the moment is that the public interest principles, so driving trust and confidence in solicitors, and the rule of law, principles 1 and 2, they are really the most fundamental principles and issues relating to professional ethics, and they will remain to be really, really important. So summing it up for me, ethics for me is about doing things like, when you make a mistake, having the confidence to admit mistakes. When you're being asked to do something that you're not competent to do, being clear about that and not going ahead with it. Perhaps I should have thought about that before I did this talk. And thirdly, it's about standing up to people when you see things that aren't being done right. It's all of our roles to stand up, to be counted, isn't it? And to treat people with respect and dignity. So a combination of all of those things melded together is what professional ethics is about for me, and why I took on the job.
And Dan, explain that, well, anything to add to that, but also maybe explain a little bit about your organisation.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me. So, Dan Kane, founder of O-Shaped, but historically I've been in private practice for many years, then a general counsel at Network Rail for many years as well, before focusing exclusively on O-Shaped, which is really, and our mission is to close the gap between law and business. And that looks at how do we support, enable, and help our profession to deliver services to clients, to users, in a better, more efficient, more effective way. And really at the heart of that is people and skills and behaviours and mindsets. And so that really has allowed us to work cross-industry, ethics being core to that because it's so central to how we do our job and the trust that people have in us. So it means I'm in a very privileged position to work across both sides of the fence and to see things day to day in real practice across a number of different organisations. In terms of the ethics question, I look at it a bit more personally. I get the feeling that many people would know the difference between right and wrong. I actually asked my kids before I came today, 11-year-old and 7-year-old, if they knew the difference between right and wrong. It turns out they do know the difference. They don't necessarily apply it, which is clearly not what we want to hear. But in many respects, given the profession that we've come into, given how that we have developed into our careers, we kind of have a pretty strong sense of justice. We have a pretty strong sense of right and wrong. And I worry less, believe it or not, about lawyers knowing what the right thing to do is. I worry much more about the pressures that are around us to ensure we do it. And so the way in which I've always felt and seen it work is when I've been in organisations that genuinely have this kind of framework of values that people can use as their North Star. And that really helps decision-making follow something of a path which we can all rely on and go back to when we have those difficult moments. And I'm sure we'll get into more detail on that. But having that line of sight and knowing in your heart and hearts what's right and wrong, for me, is what ethics is all about. And we've all had it, that pit in the well of your stomach, when you feel you may have done something wrong. That, for me, is when you know you've crossed that line.
Yeah. Lucy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that about from your perspective, or whether we'll just move on to some more details about from the SRA's.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything specific that I wanted to add.
So, Jonathan, it feels like the SRA is placing a much bigger or heavier focus on professional ethics recently. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think to a degree. I don't know if the finance director's here, but I've not noticed an increase in my budget.
Right.
I'll say that. But I think this is probably broader than the legal sector. So one thing I noticed last week is that the government launched an Ethics and Integrity Commission. So, you know, the whole issue of ethics more generally in society, I think, is under greater scrutiny. And I think, you know, a lot of it is about lack of trust and needing ethical behaviour to stand out, really, to deal with that general lack of trust across all areas. I think, you know, ethics has always been a key part of the SRA's mission, but obviously a number of high-profile events. So, you know, I'm sure that there's quite a few, but things like the Post Office Horizon scandal, the things that you talked about in the introduction, misuse of slaps, etc., those high-profile issues have quite understandably created more scrutiny on this area, and that's led to the LSB's consultation on professional ethics, which we're, you know, really looking forward to seeing their response and then thinking about how we can do even more in this area to support the profession. So I think it's, you know, it's not a new thing, but understandably there have been external drivers and societal changes that drive more scrutiny in this area.
Dan, you've got a lot of experience in private and in-house practice. Just talk to me about how important a workplace culture is with in this area.
I mean, I think it's central for a number of reasons, really. I mean, culture, we may all have our own views of what it is, but essentially it's how things are done around here, right? How we operate within an organisation that we are in. And it really is central to the mindsets, the behaviours, the values that we have as an organisation. And I think aligned with culture comes what many organisations will have values, these values that perhaps we see on the wall that are, again, trying to define what it means to work in a particular organisation. And I think if done well and having the right culture that is one that is inclusive, that is open, that recognises and values its people and rewards its people appropriately, the right culture can drive brilliant performance, but also it can drive the right decision-making in ethics. The opposite, of course, can also be true. People will be familiar with toxic cultures that lead to very poor leadership, very poor management, driving exactly the wrong behaviours. And I want to just focus for a minute on something that we'll hear a lot of if you're out there and you're interested in what different organisations are doing at the moment. They have this high-performance culture. People talk about high performance. And I'm a big fan of this idea of high-performance cultures. But one of the risks is the incentives it creates. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples where if we create the wrong incentives, it can really lead to poor ethical decision-making. And I'll give one from my past on the railway. When with all the right intentions, very centrally set approach was saying, out in our 5 different regional units, we're going to have a target that shows we're going to reduce the incidence of harm to our people on the network. So we want to reduce the number of injuries. Of course, makes a really sensible approach that we want to reduce harm to people. The difficulty is we also incentivize people with bonuses off the back of successful results in that regard. Now, what happens? The risk, if it goes wrong, is people, as they did, started hiding the numbers, the injuries. Oh, it's not really a workplace injury because they just hurt their thumb. Or it's not really qualifying, so we'll start to look for ways to get around it because human behavior will focus on its incentives. Now, let's bring that a little bit back to our own workplace and give you an example that we see regularly in the law that troubles me hugely about the legal profession, and that's aligning the number of hours we do with bonuses and therefore the incentive to hit targets, and ultimately the more we do, the more money we get as a result of a bonus. Now that worries me on a number of occasions and I've seen in the past, but one in particular, a firm we used to work with said that they had to fire someone who was on our account. And it was because they described it as they had their hands in the till. I think what they meant was they were inflating their hours in order to hit their bonus. And it's probably something we've been aware of in the past. Now, the big worry for me was not that that happened, But it was almost the pride in which the firm said to me, and we fired them, we're all over this, we're completely in control of it. Rather than, we've looked into why people are doing this. And that was the question that I felt needed to be answered. Why is it that someone who is relatively junior feels the need to try and inflate their hours in order to achieve a bonus? And we're not looking at that question enough. And this is what I meant about driving the right behaviors. We know, and that individual will have known, that it was the wrong thing to do. But regardless of that, the culture, the environment drove that behavior. And for someone to sacrifice their whole career on the back of that troubles me greatly.
Yeah. Lucy, you were nodding away there. When it comes to culture, anything to add to what Dan was saying?
I think really just to draw out the importance of leadership and the impact that leadership can have. If any of you were in this hall for the session this morning around continuing competence, you will have heard about, you know, the tone from the top and the impact that that can have. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, leadership is absolutely central to creating the organisation's culture and creating the sort of culture of doing the right thing. There's lots of research about how we learn through our environment. So having leaders who are demonstrating ethical leadership, who are modelling expected behaviours, really helps everyone learn and help embed those practices as part of, you know, the organisation's norm, as it were. Ultimately, I think, you know, you're wanting your leaders to create an environment in which ethical considerations are front of mind. And so it's important that you've got a leadership who really embody doing the right thing and are seen to embody it. It's walking the walk. It's, you know, it's living that experience. It's really leading by example. And it really crosses over into that sort of, you know, broader cultural piece. When we went out to firms as part of a big project that my team was involved in, looking at culture and how firms develop that sort of positive workplace environment, something that came through really strongly was the importance of being clear around expectations. And I think that applies, you know, to your values, your ethical values. And Dan's already spoken about, you know, organisations and their sort of statements of values. Lots of organisations shape those with their staff body so that you get buy-in. But I think ultimately it's about making sure that those are lived. So we saw some really good examples of firms who sort of referred to those values, those ethical statements, as part of a sort of golden thread, as it were, really, a thread that goes through. They're picked up in one-to-ones, in annual reviews, in pay reviews, in promotion processes. So actually living the ethical approach, living, you know, the right behaviours, actually, or not doing that, has a really tangible impact. And I think that's really important, and that's a big part of the messaging that leaders can develop. I know slogans aren't for everyone, but actually I was on a panel earlier in the year at an in-house conference on a similar topic, and one of the speakers spoke really passionately about this and about the impact that one leader in her organisation in particular had. And it was a general counsel, and apparently he, you know, sort of for years and years and years had used this slogan about speak truth to power. And it was such a part of how they handled themselves, what this particular general counsel expected of, you know, himself, what he held his team accountable to. And it really did, you know, it was a great example of how when you're living that every day, it becomes the norm. Her story finished with a present that was given on their departure, where they bought a hard hat for this particular general counsel. They worked at National Highway, so there is a link there. It's not just a random hard hat, but emblazoned with the letters STTP. And I think that really resonated with everyone in the room, that actually, and really good example, as I say, of someone who walks the walk. You're not just sort of, you know, trotting off these things with no real impact and meaning. And it's all about it's about how things are done, not just the what. And I think that's the part that we all have to play, but leaders in particular, I think, you know, really need to be living that.
And how do you teach that? Can you teach that level of leadership, or, you know, help those leaders who, you know, or help the ones that it doesn't come naturally to? They've been promoted because they're good at their job, but just because they're good at their job doesn't mean they're going to be really good leaders.
No, I think there's an awful lot that needs to be done around training, actually giving people the skills to support, again, that clarity of what's expected, but actually, equipping people to do the right thing, to know what they're looking out for, and how to embed that with others. And I think there's a whole process around embedding it in systems.
Yeah, I was gonna, how do you teach ethics, really? I mean, it's character as much as anything, isn't it? It's not a thing that you can particularly learn. And I think,
So if that's the case, how do you spot it?
Well, that's a very, very good question. Let me come back to you on that. How do you spot it? I mean, I know the way we deal with things in the ethics teams. So, we have a meeting every morning between 9 and 10 to deal with the most tricky ethical issues. And the only way that we can really deal with them is by a sort of group conversation, and we have fairly long debates about things, but eventually we will always reach a conclusion. So, yeah, I think it's very much around sort of sharing experiences. Yeah. It's not something you can read a book and learn. I think very much, and certainly one of the parts of the LSB consultation talks about, what more can be done on education and training in this area. And I think really that facilitated group discussion is a really great way of doing that. But yeah, I'll have to think about how do you spot someone who's ethical. Well, it's someone
maybe there aren't, maybe people would say a natural leader, but then a natural leader isn't necessarily the most ethical leader. It might actually be the opposite. Natural leader might be the one with all the charisma and absolutely no foibles.
Well, it's the person in the pub who admits that they've been underbilled, isn't it? So
yeah.
I imagine on this, my experience of you see it, you know it when you see it. You ask a team of 10 people and they all, if one of them is not ethical, the other 9 will know who it is. The other one who isn't probably doesn't realise who it is. Yeah. Right. So I think you can. I also think to an extent you can teach it. And I think from this perspective, I'm not necessarily saying teach the subject ethics. I'm teaching how do you, first of all, to this point about leadership. I think we have a leadership crisis in our profession, by the way, and I know that's quite strong, but I think we train it to a very limited extent. We put experts in leadership positions without the skills, the capability, or the desire quite often to want to lead and manage people. I think leadership training is part of being able to get a better ethical culture. I think that no doubt the term people might be familiar with is psychological safety. We don't have enough development and training on psychological safety, which is all about can we create a safe space for people to share what's going on for them. That's teachable, right? So there are different elements that we can look at and teach to create the environment where people will recognise things that are wrong. Now, recognising it's wrong is one thing. We've got to create an environment where people will call it out as well, and that's the whole psychological safety piece.
Yeah. And obviously we've touched on this, but whether you can do training, leadership or ethical decision making, but is there anything else to add? And whether that, because if we're not talking about the leaders now, but sort of everybody, apart from everybody having a voice, speaking truth to power, perhaps getting rid of some of that pyramid hierarchy, which very often stops a whistleblower or somebody from speaking up. Are there any other things that businesses or law firms should be thinking about in how to avoid the pitfalls? No.
Shall I
pick
up on some of that? I think there are all sorts of things that you can try and do to sort of embed this within within your frameworks. I think it's look for those training opportunities. Actually, think about what are the ethical issues that that come across the desk, and how can you use those to learn, so that actually highlighting as well the importance to everyone of doing the right thing and how everyone has a part to play in that. Actually, we've spoken a lot about leaders, but actually it applies to everyone within an organisation. Making sure that those conversations are happening at all ends of the spectrum. So lots of emphasis on the junior end of the profession, but actually those that are in senior roles as well. Actually, it's something that evolves and develops, so you want to keep it live and you want to keep it really relevant and pertinent. And I think, a bit to the points that have come up already, it's about valuing, it's valuing the how as much as anything else. So it's making sure that there is a sort of, a tangible impact, that it becomes part of the DNA, and finding those opportunities to do that. Dan's already spoken about, psychological safety and no blame culture, but I mean, that's really, really critical so that people are prepared and willing to speak up, because there's not going to be blame, there's not going to be retaliation or judgment. And I think, again, touches on some of the themes we've already covered, but it's making sure that you're providing support for, for your staff and for everyone who's involved in decision making. I think sometimes ethical considerations can be sort of crowded out by sort of competing business priorities or other issues. And I think this is where, again, you see that crossover really with the wider culture piece. Because actually quite often, poor decisions or making decisions that don't align with an organisation's values will often come when you're at those moments of real stress and high pressure, or if someone's working in isolation. So I think, trying to pick off some of those risks, spot those risks, manage them and deal with them, and hopefully all of that sort of contributes to, just really embedding this in part of the cultural norm.
Because you just mentioned that issue of competing situations, competing duties, so clients, courts, public and commercial interests, that sort of conflict, and also picking up on what Dan was saying earlier about bonuses. The pay structure can be very conflicting as well, and I wonder how you help people navigate that.
And so some thoughts on that. Just before I do, one thing I think law firms can do, just struck me, as you're saying, is we could be much bolder in rewarding the right behaviour as opposed to rewarding just the numbers. And who are held out at law firms, certainly in my experience, were those who were the biggest billers, not necessarily the ones that demonstrated the right behaviours. And if we could recognise those who demonstrated, if we think ethics is so important, as I'm sure in this room we do, well, let's reward people for it, right? So there are things that you can do if we can get the incentives right. On this duty and this conflict, I wonder in some respects if there really is a conflict. We talk a lot about this tension about making sure that we are upholding our duty and upholding the rule of law, which clearly comes first, right? So this duty to the court comes first. And I think if it's very clear like that, there's no problem. Most of the issues arise when there is much more a commercial challenge here. And that commercial piece, whether you're in-house or in private practice, I think plays out the same way, which is ultimately we as a business want to achieve certain outcomes that requires us to make money. When that starts to conflict with our own organisational values, our organisational ethics, then that presents much more of a challenge. Not necessarily the obvious duty to the court, much more about what's the right thing to do again. And each organisation has to balance this risk. Balance the risk of reputation, balance the risk of making sure they're still making the right amount of money. And you can have frameworks that can help you do that. It's back to how do we set these frameworks up to give us the guidance to make the right decisions at the right time. And again, back to training, you can learn different ways of making better decisions. If anyone's familiar with the Heath brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, they've got this brilliant book called Decisive, which is quite useful if we're talking about decisions. And that talks about a model for making better decisions, not just in law, but generally. And all that's talking about is how you give yourself distance, how you're able to start looking at things through different lenses, how you're able to perhaps recognize where you've got this kind of confirmation bias and you step back from it, and enabling you to make those much more sensible, pragmatic decisions. You're absolutely right that often these poor ethical decisions are made in times of stress and emotionally when we're overcome. If you can give yourself that space and step back, follow a framework that you have set up, you will be much better guided to making better decisions and not having to worry so much about this tension. And then finally, look, sometimes we get it wrong, right? Not because we absolutely want to, but because we fall on the wrong side of the line. And the important thing is that we can own up to that, learn our lessons and move on.
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit about mistakes in my opening around the criticality of how they're dealt with, how people are really vulnerable when they report an error and they need to be dealt with, treated in really the right way and make that a positive experience. And one thing that, I think works really well in practice is lessons learned, really positive lessons learned sessions in terms of, not only in terms of ethical issues which often come out of errors, but also, practice improvements as well. So making the way errors are dealt with a really positive experience and actually rewarding that behaviour and reporting things, I think, again, is very much back to Dan's point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So welcome back, and I hope you enjoyed the recording there. I'd also like to welcome back our three panelists who you'll just have seen there with Daisy in the recording, and who are here to take your questions for the remainder of today's session. I know you've been virtually introduced already in the recording, but just as a quick reminder then, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Dan Kane, the founder and CEO of O-Shaped, Lucy Henderson, the head of regulatory management at the SRA, and Jonathan White, head of professional ethics at the SRA. So we're going to dive into some questions now. We've had some that we think actually will likely be better covered at some of our other sessions. So just to mention quickly, Anita, we've got an accounts rules queries session on Thursday, which would be great to pick up your question there. And Simon Williams, we have our compliance queries session tomorrow, and a whole section on conflicts of interest there. So again, that would be a perfect place for your question. So I wondered if I could start firstly with Jonathan. It was really interesting in the recording there to hear your take on integrity, and that it's about doing the right thing when no one is watching. Now, what do you think that can look like, I guess, in practical terms when solicitors are providing legal services, in terms perhaps of the types of questions solicitors might ask themselves when those ethical dilemmas might present themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite an easy thing to say, isn't it? Do the right thing when no one's looking. I guess um, it's when it's when things are inconvenient or difficult that this is really put to the test. So the kind of situations I'm thinking about in particular would be things like where you've made a mistake and you need to you need to admit that, or probably the most sort of difficult and testing circumstances would be having to report misconduct. That's very, very difficult from an ethical perspective. I guess probably one lens to always, I think probably to take a step back, and one lens to always look at ethical decision making is what would the person on the other side expect of me? So as a a legal professional with high professional standards, what would my client or what would the other party expect me to do? So I think in terms of ethical decision making, often turning it on its head, and thinking what the other side. So in my example, what would the waiter or the supplier expect me to do? And I think, probably another point to emphasize is um, this sort of difference between honesty and integrity. So there's a basic moral principle in society, and I think most people would know, about being honest. But there's that added layer of sort of superpowered honesty, for want of a better phrase, that leads to integrity. So I think it's thinking through all of those perspectives and thinking through, what would the profession think of me in these circumstances? What would the other party expect? So I think that's probably just an additional layer really to add to that.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jonathan, for that. Actually, it brings a question through, I think, there for Dan, if that's okay. I'd really be interested to think about in terms of that situation of doing the right thing when no one's watching as a good measure there. In the example of, I guess, new recruits potentially overbilling for hours that have not actually been worked and those kinds of things, because it's just what everybody else is doing. What advice do you think you could suggest for individuals who might find themselves facing those kinds of pressures when they've just joined or recently joined a law firm and they're in that kind of environment? Do you have any sort of tips there?
Thanks, Richard. There is clearly a whole range of different pressures that junior lawyers face when they come into the profession, and one of which I think is driven by this hours culture that we know exists. And that means that time recording, which we know has got its place, but also does lead to, as I said in the discussion, human behaviors will follow where the incentives are. And the incentives are very much to ensure that hours are met And as a result, people will, if they aren't led well, if they don't have the role modeling done correctly, they will follow suit and make poor decisions at the time in order perhaps to hit a target or to correct the date in a document, whatever it may be that sounds really small at the time and feels perhaps that, well, if everyone's doing it, it's okay. The peer pressure, the group think that can really influence junior people in particular is such a problem that I do think we need to go back to basics when we bring people in. We want people in this profession who are trustworthy, who have high levels of integrity, but we want people who are able to share when they feel like something's wrong. That gut feel, we know that something's wrong. And I think that's really hard for junior people to do. And it's a very hierarchical profession. So I would love to think, and it's easy for me to sit here as a generation at least higher than those coming through, um, to say, look, you've got to be able to at least challenge, at least say, is it the right thing to do? Your instinct will almost certainly tell you that backdating a document is the wrong thing to do. You'll know it is, and therefore find the channel or the avenue you can raise that. If it's not your direct boss, make sure you're building connections elsewhere so that you can go through a different route to speak to someone who will listen. Because it does happen, people will listen and support you. So not to perhaps be influenced by a direct boss that's under the pressure themselves and perhaps is really encouraging you to make the wrong decision.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Dan. Um, yeah, that law firm culture point again. If I could put a question to Lucy at this point. So if you're sort of looking the other way in at that, so obviously we have people joining law firms, but then from the perspective of senior leaders and the tone, I guess, that they can be instrumental in setting within their firms and model those behaviours that they might expect to see across their workforce. How important do you think it is for leaders to set that example very clearly and to create the right environments for ethical behaviour within law firms?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think it's really important, and it's almost the other side of Jonathan's good quote earlier of doing doing the right thing when no one's looking. This is about being very visible, doing the right thing. I think it's really easy to underestimate the impact that leaders have, but they really do have to set the standard. And we know that we learn from the behaviours that we see around us. And if you want staff to be doing the right thing, and you want that that right ethical behaviour to become part of an organisation's DNA, then it's really central to the whole process that leaders are absolutely walking the walk, not just talking the talk, and very much a question of do what I do as well as do what I say. So I think it's you can't underestimate the impact that it has and the importance of that sort of shadow that leaders cast.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Actually, while I've got you, we've got a question here around systems and processes that you might have seen in your experience that are being used quite effectively within law firms with an intention to really drive ethical behaviour and ethical decision making at kind of a grassroots level. What are the kinds of things that you might have seen, or the things that sort of stand out to you in terms of those types of tools and processes?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a whole range of different things that firms can think about. And one thing, actually, it might be a good opportunity just to highlight if anyone hasn't seen, or just to refresh their memories. Back in 2022, we published a thematic review around workplace culture, actually. And that had a whole series of actions and checklists, which, whilst brought together under the banner of workplace culture, as we covered in the discussion that's just been shown, it's so closely entwined with ethics. So do take a look at that if you haven't already, because that's got some useful tips in. But I think things that can be really beneficial, and making sure you've got regular and appropriate support and supervision for staff. Think about what your culture really looks like and how that can be improved. think about what matters when it comes to measuring success. We spoke in the earlier discussion about how important it is to make sure that the right behaviours are being rewarded, and people aren't being rewarded for the wrong behaviours. So think about what matters when it comes to measuring success. Does your performance management system motivate ethical behaviours and motivate people to do their best? And are you rewarding and recognising people doing the right thing? Again, we spoke previously about the golden thread that one firm mentioned, by having their sort of values and expected behaviours being very much part of their review process, their remuneration process, and promotions. I think actually we've seen some really effective changes being made where firms have brought in sort of more board level governance or oversight, and to really develop strategies, people undertaking regular risk assessments, and managing stress, given working environment can sometimes impact on the nature of the decisions that people make. Looking there, I would say as well, particularly at risk assessing for different work areas or clients, to monitor issues, identifying risks, and record how those are addressed. And then actually picking up one of the points that Dan mentioned around, the sort of the billing approach to billing. Think about, does your approach to billable hours targets, does that pose any risk to ethical decision making? And then I think sort of circling back to that first point about regular supervision and support, is actually giving managers the training and the time and the resource to support staff. We know that being a good lawyer and progressing up through the ranks doesn't necessarily equate to being good managers. So make sure you've got systems in place that are giving them the support and training that they need.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lucy. Jonathan, did you have any views on that one as well?
Yeah, just not a huge amount to add to what Lucy said, but I think what I've seen in various firms work particularly well is around lessons learned. So things are always easy when things go right. It's how you deal with things and learn from your mistakes in a really positive and productive way. So I've seen lots of good practice in firms where they will look at mistakes or errors and get together and look at how that could have been dealt with differently or better, and that really is done in a very positive way, really promoting a reporting culture, and everyone being praised really for raising those kind of issues and looking at them in more detail.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks both on that one. So we've had a question come in. I'll just read this out for you. So do you have advice on challenging behaviour that could be classed as unethical when others are attempting to impose improper requests on solicitors just because of their profession? And so there's been an example provided as well with that, about demanding that they give undertakings not to disclose information rather than relying on basic confidentiality. So yeah, advice that might spring to mind for people who find themselves in those kinds of situations. If I can come to Dan firstly.
Yeah, I'm just going to give you an example from the in-house world. I was formerly a general counsel, and this kind of thing happened regularly, not perhaps through a deliberately improper request, but I think the principle carries across the whole profession. What we'd often get asked is, can I send this through you so then it's without prejudice? And so it was almost just simply sending on a note to the lawyer because they'd heard about this concept of without prejudice, this would give some protection further down the line. And we had to educate people. Why should people know? Why should we assume that people understand when we've previously engaged with them on a without prejudice basis to protect the conversations, that them simply just wanting to send something to us was different from us actually having a meaningful conversation with them? So from our perspective, it was about, how do we not just seek to blame? Let's look at how we educate. Let's understand how we can help those who need our support and our advice, that there are ways that we can work together, but one of them isn't simply either demanding that we use our solicitor qualification for something, but also if you're mistaken, let's help you understand. It's a really common thing that happens in-house, and I imagine it's something that clients are often asking in private practice too, and I think there's an education piece there. Just a final thought on this. there's a question comes into this idea of demanding that solicitors behave differently. I think if there's a demand from someone that's intentionally looking to use you in order to achieve an outcome that's not ethical, then my initial reaction is, well, we are absolutely at the heart of a profession that needs to be able to say no in those circumstances. But again, I'd like to be able to get to understand why that's being asked, as opposed to simply just say no. What's the reason behind it? So let's understand it so we can explain, and hopefully then the request goes away.
That's great. Thanks for that, Dan. Brilliant. So another question, we'll go straight into this one. This is perhaps a great one for Jonathan and Lucy, actually. So I'll come to Jonathan firstly. So what are some of the queries that we receive into the SRA around professional ethics?
Yeah, so we get about 20 quite a few queries. So we get about 25,000 ethics related questions each year into the helpline. So that's about, I mean, if you look at the size of the profession, so there's about 200,000 solicitors. So it's not quite sort of 1 in 10 people will ask one ethics query per year. And it's very consistent. So we do keep data on this to just look at trends and really to just look at whether we're giving appropriate guidance and whether, you know, we're providing the right support. And there are always gaps and things that we need to do more on, but the themes tend to be the same. So what our data says is it will be conflicts of interests and the thinking around that. Confidentiality is another very, very common area. Reporting. So do I need to report this situation to you as a regulator? Often, you know, that is not straightforward at all. But I think actually we tend to get the questions that we get. I would generally consider to be high quality questions. So they will often involve a mix of different rules or principles and some law in there as well. So what this says to me really is that I know there's a lot of focus on ethics and a need to do more, and the LSB you know, are looking at that, but certainly the range and quality of questions that we get into the ethics helpline is certainly not an indicator that there's any ethical deficit. It's really clear to me that, you know, the profession are thinking very, very carefully about their responsibilities, and the stuff that comes through to us every day is pretty complicated, and you can well understand why, you know, you wouldn't want to be sitting in an office on your own trying to work this out for yourself without support. So yeah, it's the things that you'd probably think: conflicts, confidentiality, reporting. We obviously get a whole range of questions about what I'd call sort of non-ethical issues, so specific questions around our rules, because obviously there are lots of rules. There's, you know, 150 pieces of guidance, warning notices and cases. There's a lot of detail to get through. So yeah, they're the most common areas that we see typically.
Lovely. Thanks, Jonathan. And Lucy, how does that compare with some of the firms that you all engage with in terms of those more ethical issues? Does that correlate as well there in terms of some of those really quite technical and tricky issues that they're coming to you with?
Yeah, absolutely. Really similar list actually in terms of, you know, conflicts, confidentiality, reporting, you know, considering an issue and thinking, well, has that now hit the reporting threshold? Other things, interestingly, that started to come in following the change to the rules a year or so ago around workplace culture and those expectations around behaviours were things like, you know, how do managers challenge, you know, behaviour that's deemed unacceptable? How should that be recorded? And, you know, when does perhaps a lack of challenge, you know, where does that become a reportable issue? And sort of really understanding the nuts and bolts of how, you know, how the rules work and what the expectations are in terms of how firms should be implementing them. But broadly, a really similar range of pieces that come into our team, and the ones that come into Jonathan's.
Yeah. Richard, can I just add something on the earlier question that we had about people asking solicitors to do stuff? And it's really, I mean, the example would, you know, you need to give me an undertaking. This is really, really, really common. You know, in private practice, we get a lot of calls around this, particularly undertakings is a great example. And you know, people should be quite cautious about that because you know undertakings are a very big responsibility, very big commitment, and obviously any uncertainty the recipient benefits from that. So yeah, we do see people being pushed to give undertakings, and you know clearly you don't have to do that. And similarly, we get a lot of questions about dealing with litigants in person, particularly in litigation, and you know, being asked to go way beyond what you know we'd expect professionals to do, and people are very very afraid of being seen to be taking unfair advantage. So, you know, I do have quite a lot of sympathy with the profession about being asked to do stuff just because they're a solicitor, and that's one of the things that my team can help people through really in getting that balance right and not being obviously pushed into doing things that go way beyond our expectations.
Right. Thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Actually, I think we're seeing some really quite thorny issues here. On that note, there is a question that I'd be really interested to get views from all three of you on. Actually, that's quite a biggie, I guess. So I'll just read this to you. So if there was no renewed emphasis on professional ethics and everyone carried on doing what they were currently doing, what would be the implications? So it's it's quite a big one. But if I could
Wow.
come to, without giving you too much thinking time, if I'll come straight to Dan on that
Yeah,
one to see
go
what
to
your
Dan
gut
first.
reactions are.
And thank you for dropping me that one. So I go back to the basic premise that I think the vast majority of people do what they do brilliantly every day and know exactly which direction to go, right? And I think that that would remain in place. Um, Notwithstanding, there are 25,000 queries that come in a year. What we used to say in our team back in house is if we weren't here, what would happen, right? What would happen if we weren't here supporting the organization on making decisions that were often quite difficult? And ultimately, the business would carry on, right? Things would carry on. Um, and people would have to make some more decisions for themselves. They might have the helpline, that's a great tool and great guidance, but they would make the decision. And I bet you the vast majority of time, they would err on the side of caution and make the right decision, or at least not make the wrong decision. So I think that it would be a slow and very gradual decline when it came to the level of what's expected of people in the profession if there is no continued update guidance, thematic reviews, and it would soon lose its place on the agenda, and that would be a pretty dangerous thing in the longer term. I think in the shorter term, people would find a way around it, but certainly thinking about how much emphasis we're placing on ethics now, quite rightly, both in-house and across the profession, that's not just happening because we've all got plenty of time to start deciding and dreaming up something to do. It's because it's just fundamental to the fabric of our profession. So I think without that continuous thinking around it, it would ebb away gradually, and things would I don't think overnight we'd see this massive shift to unethical behavior, but I think over time what becomes acceptable would start pushing further and further over the line that we now currently expect.
Thanks, Dan. Well handled. And I think I'm going to come now to Lucy.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think actually share very similar thoughts to Dan. I don't think there would be any sort of immediate overnight change. I think, typically people are trying to do the right thing and wanting to do the right thing, and we see that very much through much of the engagement that we have. And actually, the fact that people are phoning the professional ethics helpline with these queries and wanting support and guidance with that, I think, just sort of support that people want to be doing the right thing. But I think you know, that may well shift over time, as Dan has said. But I think some of this would be driven by sort of societal expectations as well, actually. And you know, that whole piece around doing the right thing, and how does that fit into you know, people's views around, you know, from a societal perspective. So I think it will there will be a long and slow decline, but I don't think there'll be anything sort of, you know, seismic happening within a short period of time.
Thanks, Lucy. And Jonathan.
Yeah, I'm just glad the other two got to go first on this one. Yeah, what have I got to add on this? I mean, I think it's probably sort of like anything, isn't it? Unless you try to improve whatever it is you're doing, you're almost certain to go backwards, aren't you? So, you know, that's with the profession in terms of ethical behaviour. That's the SRA in terms of, you know, what we do and the support we provide. So I think it's always incumbent upon people to try and improve. I think like colleagues have said, you know, nothing's going to happen quickly or overnight unless obviously we get, you know, more significant high profile events like, you know, the ones that are sort of very much in the public domain, and they can rapidly have an impact in overall trust and confidence just because of their profile. I think, you know, if we just left everything on its own for, you know, a substantial period, I think inevitably you're going to get poorer outcomes, and then that doesn't help anyone, because that will lead to really calls for more prescriptive regulation, more external oversight, more controls. So it's in all of our interest really to get this right, so you know we don't get more prescriptive regulation. So yeah, it's you know, working on this, you know, working on the fitness around this, I think is really in the long-term interests of the profession. And I think, just to emphasise, the Law Society have done some great work on this area as well. I think Professor Baxter, there's really great resources online around ethical behaviour, really thought-provoking stuff, great new resources around whistleblowing and those kind of stuff. So I encourage everyone, you know, to keep up with the guidance that we're putting out, but also the Law Society have done some really great work here as well. So to all keep our sort of levels of fitness up on ethical behaviour, there's so many great resources out there to help with that.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Yeah, plenty of things to, yeah, as you say, to make sure we keep our hand in terms of, yeah, making sure people are improving and understanding actually what's the latest thought processes around these issues. It's a huge thanks to everyone who's taken the time to send us questions, and also to our brilliant panelists there today. And apologies if we didn't get round to your question today, but there are many more sessions through the week, hopefully when you'll get the opportunities to put some of those back through to us. So do check the listings for our other events actually during the virtual compliance conference. A quick flag that the next session is coming up. So tomorrow, Tuesday the 4th of November, we have the Solicitors Qualifying Examination SQE 4 years on session, and then at 2:30 we're going to be discussing your compliance queries as well, so do make a note of those too. Just a quick plea before we sign off: if you have a moment to let us know your feedback about this session, then we'd love to hear it, so please do click on the feedback link that you'll find below the video. And all that remains to say today is that we hope you've enjoyed this session, and a big thank you again for watching. Goodbye.